So, so last time we were together, we were talking about photography and the landscape. And I'd been sort of showing how photography had sort of expanded the way people saw the world. That prior to the invention of photography, people, most normal people, with the few exceptions of the rich, and those were mostly landed gentry and all that sort of stuff, but rarely traveled more than 100 miles away from their home. They didn't know what places looked like that were further than that. And a lot of those people were illiterate as well. So they weren't really reading descriptions of, let's say, the Great Pyramid or, the Nile River, whatever it is that you think is far away and exotic. Photography began to sort of bring those places into people's living rooms. And if you remember, I started sort of introducing the idea of the stereopticon, or the stereo pictures, which gave a very realistic 3D effect. It's almost like a virtual reality still image, which of course is, continued to be popular until this day. And so, more and more photographers specifically would go on extended journeys to far off places to bring back photographs, and that would be the specific goal of their journey. So one of those people that I'd begun to sort of show a few slides of was a man named Francis Frith from England. Now, Frith is he's a sort of odd fellow. Let me go back to the first view of his. Now you can see in the bottom right corner, I know it's very faint and there's just little scribbles down there, but you can see starting here, these are Frith images. And he was someone who, he was a businessman, an entrepreneur, and he began this, he sort of came up with this idea that he wanted to actually photographically illustrate the Bible, the First Testament in particular. Or the first one, whatever. I'm not religious, so, but I know there's two of them, and it was the first one, right? So he then, it's sort of like he did a GoFundMe or something like that, where he essentially went around to wealthy people in England specifically and asked them to sort of put up some cash in the front, to front him some money, so to speak, to do this journey. And when he had finished it, he would then give them this Bible. It was incredibly elaborate. I've seen one of them in the New York Public Library, with gold edges, and it's large. It's like 14 by 20 inches, and every other page or so has a photograph. And he took the text of the Bible to locate these specific places in all over the world, but mostly primarily in the Middle East, of course, where it all sort of started. And so, and so he went off and he sort of made a series of photographs in these places that are described in the Bible, and then put those together and bound them into this very fancy illustrated Bible. Someone's coughing and I can hear you. And it was a success, a huge success. So this was sort of like the first, it's almost like a subscription thing where if you get enough people to and it is like GoFundMe or one of those other things like it. If enough people contribute to the idea, then he can afford to, get all the materials and the journey and the time and the expenses that it takes to make this incredibly interesting document. And so now he didn't just stick to that, by the way. He did other journeys to other places in addition to that one, but that's the one that sort of is the most well known of his journeys. There's a kind of starkness to them. There's a lot of ruins along the Nile River, for example. And so again, of course, he did stereos on glass. These are also done on paper as well. So there's different versions of the same image either on a stereo card or as a print. And he continued to do this sort of thing for many, many years, and then had a sort of terrible business failure and lost all his money and sort of had to quit for a while. And then he came back and he sort of focused primarily on the United Kingdom. And there's this incredible archive of his work that's online, mostly of the latter half of his career, which was primarily in the UK. So I don't remember the names of all of these places. I haven't been to these places. I don't know if they still even look the same, since this was, 150, 60 years ago. So now here's an image that you should all be aware of at this point, right? This is a Roger Fenton photograph, and it's of a battle scene. And I talked a little bit about the Civil War battle scene, where Timothy O'Sullivan, if you remember, had sort of taken representative soldiers and sort of arranged them on the battlefield, or even moved them to other locations on different days to sort of use them over and over again. Of course, the big debate in the article I asked you all to read about this picture is whether or not the cannonballs were on the road or off the road and then added by Fenton. I don't want to go into that conversation right now, but I think it's a really interesting idea that photographers at the time, what we would call sort of news photographers or documentary photographers, had no qualms about setting up the scene. I mean, there's an interesting discussion about this picture in the 3 articles that I asked you to read, and I saw some of you last week commented on them, and I think that you either love that and can't stop reading it because it's such a great mystery, or it's just like going on and on and on. But for me, the first couple of times I read it, I was just like couldn't stop reading it. But one of the things they pointed out is like, when this battle would have happened, it would have been so this was Crimea, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a battle between the English imperialists who were going to take it over and the people who lived there. And so what would happen is that they would sort of shoot cannonballs at each other. And at some point they'd sort of run out of cannonballs, so they'd pick up the ones that the other side shot at them and shoot them back. And so the same cannonball might go back and forth like 3 or 4 times in a battle, and they would all stay just far apart enough where it would just kind of like land in front of them and roll right there. And in the same way that I described the Civil War photographers, of course, Fenton is not going to like do this during a battle, right? He's not going to run out onto an active, battlefield with cannonballs and gunshots firing back and forth, carry his big, huge camera, set it up on the tripod, coat the plate, dip the plate in the silver, expose the plate, process the plate because it has to be processed before it dries. He'd be shot like in half a minute. And so instead, as we saw with the Civil War, the pictures were made after the battles were over. This is considered by most people to be the first photograph of war. That's something that we still see photographs of war on the front page of the New York Times and any other sort of hard news publications that exist anymore. And so this was the sort of beginning of a genre of war photography that has continued on to this day. There's more to say about that as well, and we'll sort of talk about that in a different context. But this is Fenton's photography van that he would have been riding around in. It included his darkroom. That's not him, I've learned, that's his assistant. But all of the camera gear and chemistry, the glass, and all the other stuff that was necessary to make photographs at the time would have been inside this wooden wagon. And this is, of course, the article that I've asked you to read, which we'll discuss more, but not right now. So also, sort of a little bit later, but not that much later, the U.S. Geological Survey was founded, the USGS, and it still exists to this day. And this is one of the images from that archive. It's similar, and it kind of came out of the 40th parallel surveys that we talked about at the beginning of this module, where Timothy O'Sullivan and a few other people were sort of sent out west to document the West and bring it back to Boston and New York, so people could see what it looked like and encourage people to go with their manifest destiny, which is a really nice word for slaughtering a lot of human people. But the USGS, the pictures are anonymous, so we don't know who took them. But a lot of the people that we've talked about so far, especially American photographers, would have been working for the US Geological Survey. The point of it initially was to sort of continue that idea that they had with this 40th parallel surveys to sort of make pictures of the beauty and the sort of, remember the word sublime nature of the American landscape in particular. Now, as we went into the 20th century, and especially into the sort of early to mid 20th century time, we didn't really know much about how to properly farm things. So we essentially, the great story is that the sort of dust bowl that happened during the Great Depression. They would farm the same crop over and over again in the same field, and it would sort of, they'd sort of suck all the nutrients out of the soil, and then when there were no more nutrients left, even grass wouldn't grow, and so then the big winds in the Midwest, in particular, sort of blew all the topsoil away, and so the U.S. Geological Survey got involved with that idea and trying to sort of use photography to show people how to, what we now call rotate crops, meaning, one year you put corn in that field, another year you put tomatoes in that field, another year you put watermelon. I don't know, but something along those lines, so that, and then a few years, you have to leave it fallow, so it just sort of has grass on it, so the nutrients can kind of sort of come back, so to speak. And so that's what these three frames here are. And then I mentioned Muybridge in another context, of course, and that was as the stop motion guy. We talked about how he sort of developed that, that system with all the animal locomotion and human locomotion, and how that sort of evolved actually into bullet time, like that relationship between Muybridge's set in California and then bullet time in the Matrix. Before he did that, he was a landscape photographer. And as I described in one of the sessions, that he lived in San Francisco and would often be out into the landscape making these pictures. Now, these are some of the same scenes that we see over and over and over in landscape photography, right? Yosemite, in particular, is a place that so many photographers, and especially the one well-known photographer, Ansel Adams, photographed in different eras and using different materials with different approaches to the subject matter. But apparently Muybridge was, as I've mentioned, kind of a character, and he would sort of bring along his assistants to go and make these scenes. You can't do photography back then alone. And he would be trying to carry these, what they call a mammoth plate camera, which I showed a picture of once. It's a 16 by 24 inch camera, up these mountains into places where even the natives that were his assistants would say, no, I'm not going there. That's crazy. You're going to die. Which sort of shows how sort of brazen he was. Interesting, in this picture, he also didn't really mind so-called photoshopping it or manipulating the image. He simply put a coin on the paper while it was being printed, and that's what looks like the sun there. And so, you can't point a camera at the sun and have it look like that. It would have all kinds of lens flare around it and other sort of optical issues. So even, at this time, people were setting up photographs, they were manipulating photographs in the darkroom. And so, photography has always had this kind of nebulous relationship with the truth or with fact. And we're going to go into that in a whole other module. But so that's Muybridge, kind of a handsome guy, stylish in a way. So now, let me see. Okay, now, actually, this is not Muybridge, is it? This is Gustave Le Gray. And Le Gray was working in France. And so again, France was very generous to photographers kind of early on. They hired Gustave Le Gray to document the sort of great structures, meaning castles and forts and sort of things like that in France early on. By the way, he used a paper, the calotype process. He used a paper negative initially. And so he went around France. His initial project looked something like this. I had a little head cold, sorry. And so this was his first real project, was sort of documenting or sort of photographing. I don't like that word documenting. I think it's really not an accurate word, but I'm using it in this context. You know, the monuments of the country of France. The materials they were using at this point, and I haven't really pointed this out very much, but if, you know, unlike that one that we saw just a moment ago, Muybridge, they were what we call panchromatic, meaning they would only see one part of the chroma or the spectrum. So wet plate, daguerreotypes, calotypes, all of those processes were very good with sort of, you know, warmer colors, the reds, the greens, the browns, the sort of earth stuff, but they were not very sensitive at all, especially to blue. So what you might have noticed in this module is that most of the scenes that we've looked at, they don't have skies, they don't have clouds. They have skies, but they don't have clouds in the sky. There would have been clouds in those skies, but to get a proper exposure for clouds, as in this picture, the landscape is completely underexposed. And so you would have to take two pictures, and Le Gray is the person who kind of came up with this idea to take two photographs, one for the sky, and then one for the seascape in this case, and then print them together on the same piece of paper so that you could get a foreground landscape in the foreground and a sky with clouds in the background. And so this is kind of one of the best known of these. And if you see a copy of it, there's one in the Met. And if you know where to look, you can see like a line that goes through between where the sort of sea ends and the sky starts, because they would literally just kind of cut the glass plate negative in this case and put them together on the paper. And so there was no like masking or any of that stuff we do in Photoshop. But the idea of taking two separate negatives, glass plates in this case, and printing them together onto the same piece of photo paper, you know, that's been around for a very long time. And Le Gray is one of the people who's credited with sort of mastering that idea.
Was he the first?
I have a question.
Okay, one at a time. So
Vanessa, you are first.
Yeah, I just asked, was he the first, if he was accredited, was he the first to try this manipulation?
It's of course impossible to answer those kinds of things because I'm sure other people had a similar idea, but he's the one that historically is credited with making this well known. That's kind of how I would describe it rather than the first to do it. He's the person we credit with making this process kind of, he published it and, you know, he talked about it, and other photographers then began to adopt this idea as well. But, you know, this Muybridge picture that I showed earlier on might have been done this way, right? Probably would have had to have been done this way. So somebody in America is doing it on the American West Coast, and then Gustave Le Gray is doing it in France. You know, and so I doubt they were writing each other letters, telling each other about it. So, you know, it's that same idea that there's a term called the zeitgeist that, you know, it's sort of like this idea that there's ideas kind of all bubbling up and that,
Yes.
you know, all of a sudden multiple people come to like combine a couple of ideas and come to the same, you know, like epiphany or something. And it seemed to be in the zeitgeist, so to speak. Yes. So another question?
Yes, yes. It's just, was the manipulation made on the level of the photo already printed or before, or on the negative? Which one did he connect it?
There were two separate negatives, one for the sky and one for the ground. So two separate negatives were then printed together in the darkroom on the paper. So, and even would have been, the sky would have been cut in such a way so that it matched up with the other half of the ground, if that makes sense.
But technically, you glue together the negatives, or you just put them on?
So the process of printing still in traditional photography is that you take an unexposed piece of photo paper, open it in darkroom safe light conditions, and then it's blank at that point. And so at that time, you would put a glass negative on top of the photo paper, and you would shine light through the back of the negative, which would then expose the photo paper. The negative would be have dark places, which would appear light in the positive print. The clear spaces in the negative would appear dark in the final print. And so at that point, before you develop it, you can put two negatives on the paper, either simultaneously or separately. Is that more clear?
Wow, yes, thank you.
It's kind of like in printmaking, you can use the same piece of paper and do different plates for different colors. They're beautiful, right? I think they're really lovely in person. They're just kind of light and airy and luscious. Later on, he was hired by the French Navy as a very sort of public relations kind of gig for him to do, where he actually had sort of control of the French Navy briefly to make these photographs of how powerful the state of France is, right? And so I imagine it's like a kid in his bathtub with some toy boats, but instead it's like the French Navy in a bay somewhere in you know, maybe the Mediterranean or something. And you know, he's sort of like manipulating these French naval vessels to make good pictures so that they could, you know, it's sort of like we've got a more powerful Navy than you do. And so, and, you know, this would even be, I mean, it continues to happen even today that the Gray was able to photograph the same boat and sort of insert multiple copies of that boat into the same picture. So it seemed like they had more naval vessels than they actually did. And if you look at this clouds up here, they're kind of unnatural, right? They seem almost like copies in a way. And a lot of these would have been actually hand drawn. And I've got some examples of the retouching where they hand make clouds in the sky. So this was a sort of continuation of his views of the ocean and the sea, but it was, you know, sponsored by the Navy. This is probably his best known image. The sort of he did a few images in sort of Paris and the environments around it, especially in the parks around Paris. but he's really best known for that other work, the seascapes and things. So he's an interesting guy. There's a really cool self-portrait of him that I didn't show. So, when we're talking about the idea of the landscape, there's also the corollary of that is the urbanscape, which for most of us is a lot more familiar than, running around the Grand Canyon or something, right? So this man is, he's French, again, Parisian photographer. One of these just kind of like, in the way that I described Timothy O'Sullivan, kind of a natural photographer, someone who just intuitively made fantastically great pictures. And he had a studio actually on the same block as Man Ray, the photographer, painter, surrealist, best friends with Duchamp, BFFs with Duchamp, right? And so Atget was, a very hard worker in the sense that every day he woke up before dawn, he loaded his plate holders. At this point, he's using dry plate photography, so he doesn't have to develop it as it's made, but instead can take the picture and then sort of leisurely bring it back to his studio to process it. He would load up all of his dry plate film holders or plate holders, go out before anybody else except the early morning workers are on the streets of Paris, and make these landscapes. In this case, it's in a park, but he's best known for, and this is Versailles, which are my favorite pictures of his, but he's sort of best known for these images of Paris. These Paris and the Environs was the book that he made. And, it's interesting how many photographers claim him to be one of their top 10 or top 5 favorite photographers. The pictures are quiet, they're poetic, there's a kind of gentle beauty to them that is really kind of amazing. And so I have a print of this. It's one of my favorite things that I own. And so his work in Paris in particular became very influential. And so as he was aging, another photographer, we're going to look at Bernice Abbott. Bernice Abbott went to Paris and worked as an assistant to Man Ray, and Bernice Abbott took this portrait of him, and as he was really quite elderly, and then she was able to sort of save his negatives from being destroyed and thrown away. So we're going to see more of him, I think, in the urbanscape sort of, when we talk about the street photography a little bit more. But now in America, around the turn of the century, so we're sort of, the manifest destiny idea has kind of come to fruition. There's railroads that go to California from the East Coast. And so there's a particular individual who becomes very important in photography for at least a couple of decades, named Alfred Stieglitz. Now, Stieglitz is a kind of quintessential New Yorker. I always think of him like a hipster in a way, like when he was like a late teen, trying to decide what he wanted to do with his life. He couldn't decide whether like going into professional bicycling, like get a fixie and a camera, right? Or photography. And so he, and his father, who was kind of wealthy, insisted that Stieglitz choose a trade. So Stieglitz was sort of trained in and I can't remember the word, but he assisted printmakers, and printing at the time, of course, was a huge industry. There was a lot of desire for printed materials. They had very recently, by the way, sort of figured out how to print photographs in publications. They hadn't been able to do that for a long period of time. And so Stieglitz was formally trained in the printmaking industry. He chose photography over bicycling as a career. I don't know how to make bicycling a career, but and so he became this kind of really powerful and influential person in photography at the time. Now, the ideas that he's best known for in particular are pictorialism, which is a kind of sort of, they declared themselves artists, not tradespeople in their photography. He published a magazine known as Camera Work Magazine, which I have a copy of, and it's still considered to be the best ever publication about serious art photography. He had a gallery in New York called 291. It was 291 Fifth Avenue. He's also kind of famous for a lot of people are interested in painting because he married Georgia O'Keeffe. He gave her her first show in New York, actually, without her knowing it, by the way. She was furious. And so Stieglitz became not only an important photographer himself, but also the publisher and the sort of central figure in this group of photographers known as the linked ring. He was also sort of wealthy enough to be able to travel to Europe, travel to Paris, and sort of know what's happening in the European art scene. Because New York and Americas were really still very much behind in the sort of world of high art, so to speak. And so Stieglitz, his kind of favorite photographer, his friend, the person that he championed most is another photographer named Edward Steichen. And Steichen is another one of these sort of seminal figures in the history of photography, since he was the first curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, this is much later, much after the pictorialist era. Steichen also was a war photographer. He was one of the people who did aerial photography during World War I. He was a fashion photographer. It's well known for his fashion work. And of course, he was the curator at MoMA. So these two guys in particular sort of made New York the center of the photography world. They sort of used photography as a means of personal expression, or an art, if you will, as well as as a tool of commerce, to sell dresses, as well as a tool of war, in this case, with the aerial photography. So Stieglitz in particular, his context in this block is this work that he did at Lake George. So Lake George is in New York, it's upstate New York, it's considerably far away actually. But at the time, you could get a boat from Manhattan, go up the Hudson River, almost to the end of the Hudson River, and then right when you couldn't go any further on a boat on the Hudson, there was a train station that you could catch a train to Lake George. And so that was sort of like the Hampty Hamps of the early 20th century, right? So all the rich people that could afford to take the summer out of New York, because it stinks like urine, as we all know, and get the hell out, would go to Lake George. And that was before they would go out to Long Island, which was where poor people lived, by the way. And so they had a house up there, O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. And both of them say that some of their best times together were up there. At the time, Stieglitz, this is kind of later in his career. And by the way, O'Keeffe is a lot younger than he is, like a lot younger than he is. So, he's sort of finished with his pictorialist era by this point. And he is slowly kind of like photographing the area around Lake George. Their house is a museum now. It's the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum up there. And slowly he sort of went from including the landscape, but a lot of sky, to almost all sky. And these pictures he began to call equivalents, sort of like what he thought of as uh, uh, the way like a musical score can be interpreted by different artists, like different musicians in different ways. So one pianist plays Bach a certain way, another pianist sings the same Bach piece, but in their own way. And so he began to see, the world in the American art world. Other things were happening as well. We were moving towards abstract expressionism and moving towards abstract art in general. And so he started very painterly in the pictorialist era with these very sort of soft and fuzzy and kind of pretty pictures. And then as he aged, he more and more started making kind of hard-edged, almost abstract photographs. Now, obviously, it's a picture of clouds at one level. There's no denying that. But he also thought of it as more like a poem or a musical piece. And he would even sort of arrange them in different arrangements to give what he sort of thought as a different sound, like photographic sound, if you can think of it that way. But he's really best known for his pictorial stuff. And the pictorialists in particular really preferred a photographic process that was available at that time commercially, called the platinum printing process. Now, this is a great example of a platinum print. It's it's a very soft photographic process. It's got lots of middle grays, but not a lot of bright whites and not a lot of deep blacks. And so the art photographers at the time, the pictorialist photographers at the time, really loved that quality, that it seemed like a kind of like a watercolor almost. And so his friend Steichen also used platinum, but on top of that same image, he would then print another process called gum bichromate prints on top of that. And he would add layers and layers and layers of color on top of the black and white picture. In the 1980s, this photograph was auctioned off at Sotheby's or Christie's or one of those places, and it went for the highest price anybody had ever paid for a photograph. It was like over $100,000, which back then people were stunned, wowed, unbelievable. Now they are handmade, by the way. So this picture, it's actually a pond in Long Island, it's called Moonrise. This reproduction isn't very good, but there's a lot of really subtle layers of color inside it. And there's that soft painterly kind of almost, wistful kind of feel to it. And so the pictures, were they were made in very limited editions because it took a lot of time to do this process. And they were almost paintings. I mean, they really were looking to, the idea, I think, was that people began, and there's still this stupid conversation that goes on, but people began to question, is photography art or not? And so one of the ways that Stieglitz and Steichen and others began to sort of try to legitimize photography as art was to make it look like painting. Now, of course, Impressionism had just happened in Europe. There was lots of soft, fuzzy paintings coming out of Paris and other European countries. And so how could photography gain legitimacy in the sort of high art world, but to make it look like those paintings, to make it look like what high art is supposed to look like at the time. They abandoned this, by the way, later on. And it's interesting to note also that the Impressionists were stealing from the sharp edgeness and the cropping and other parts of what's inherent to photography into their painting. So there's this like give and take relationship between photography and painting that started at least in that era, if not before, and absolutely continues till today. I mean, there's this conversation that photography and painting have had. It's a really fascinating sort of long-term story, and the give and take between the two disciplines or mediums, if you will. Annie Brigman is one of the better known of the pictorialist era photographers. She was printed in the Camera Work magazine that I mentioned a moment ago. She was, I think I mentioned her when we looked at her retouching process with the sort of tree and the nude. She was a sort of early feminist. She believed in the Gaia mythology, which I also think I talked about, but is this idea that Mother Earth is feminine and that the feminine is where all of life comes from, and that we should worship the feminine mother. I don't know the details, but that's kind of the major ideas behind it from what I understand. So she did a whole series of pictures of herself and her best friend sort of out in nature in the nude with this ball, which was kind of like an egg or a world at the same time. And Stieglitz loved them and printed them in camera work. So she was one of the earliest really sort of female art photographers to get a lot of recognition. It was still a very male-dominated world, no question. And even her sort of eccentric belief systems were kind of used against her in a lot of ways. We saw this image in that retouching sequence where it started, very differently than it ended up. And so pictorialists had no problems with retouching, with changing the pictures, with editing them, even drawing into them and rephotographing them and drawing onto the negative and rephotographing them, etc. So another one of the pictorialists was this guy in France, Robert Demachi. He preferred a process known as gum bichromate. I'd mentioned it a few minutes ago. It is the one that Steichen would print on top of platinum. This was basically a way of using watercolor pigments, any color that you choose. You mix it with this stuff called gum arabic, which is a kind of gooey liquid, and you add this one chemical to it, a bichromate or dichromate. Now that chemical is actually incredibly cancer-causing, which we found out many years later. But they were using it in really, really small amounts. And people still do gum printing the same way. But his pictures were, again, like I described with Steichen, many layers of color on the same image. So it takes a couple of hours to make each layer. You use the same negative, but you just sort of coat it with different colors and then expose it to the sunlight. It washes away. What happens is that as the light comes through the negative, it hardens the gum. When, like in a clear part of the negative, it will harden it, which has the pigment in it. And the dark part of the negative will hold back the sunlight, and that part will stay soft. And then you sort of gently wash it, and the gum goes away and just leaves the watercolor pigment where the sun dried it on the paper. And so this was a kind of, another kind of painterly approach to the idea of pictorialism. And we're going to see more of this in another discussion. But the processes are only important because they gave a particular look to these images that was very soft, very painterly. And so, this was a kind of dominant aesthetic in photography from maybe the very beginning of the 20th century, 1900, 1904, to at least, the war era, like 1915 or so. And so 20 years, let's say, let's give it 20 years. Now, after World War I, towards the middle of the 20th century, a group of photographers sort of turned away, almost 180 degrees away from that. And that included Stieglitz, by the way, from that sort of soft, painterly, kind of ethereal, poetic way of making pictures towards, the way they described it is, let's use photography's strengths. Let's emphasize photography's, inherent strengths, sharpness, right? And so, this kind of way of making a wide range of tones. And so a sort of unofficial, but ultimately official group of photographers formed a group in California called the F64 group. Now, what this refers to specifically is a very small aperture on the camera, right? If you do photography at all, like there's f8, f11, f5.6, f16. Most modern lenses might go to f22. And the higher the number, the smaller the aperture gets, right? And we saw, I think I showed a lens one day and how it's just like the iris in your eye. Remember, we talked about how that when you go out into a bright light, your eye stops down. When you go into a dark room, it opens up. F64 is the smallest aperture that, well, this particular group chose. I mean, there's smaller apertures than that, but what it does is it makes everything in the picture from the foreground to the background sharp, right? And as sharp as the lens can make it. And so instead of what we just saw, these like soft, fuzzy, painterly kinds of wishy-washy, poetic, sounds like a song in your head. And by the way, I love that stuff, I have to say. I sound like I'm mocking it, but I'm not. And instead began to emphasize this really sort of hard edge, sharp images. And Ed Weston, although not nearly as well known as Ansel Adams, was by far the most interesting of this group. So Weston's pictures, you can also see there's, as I mentioned briefly earlier about Stieglitz, we're coming to the mid-century where abstraction is the dominant aesthetic in painting and even in sculpture and other mediums. And so, if we look at Weston's pictures, yeah, at one level it is sand dunes and I don't know where it is, somewhere in the West Coast. But it's sort of like shapes and lines and tones, almost like a figure, maybe. Not sure if this one works that well. But so Weston's pictures, his best known project is this one that he did at California Bay. I think it's called Los Lobos, but I can't remember the name if that's not right. And again, if you look at these kind of with one eye closed and kind of like, yeah, it's branches and rocks, but it's also, if you look at abstract expressionism paintings, you can see that there is this similarity, this relationship between form and shape and tone and composition that is similar to what's going on with de Kooning and other sort of well-known Abex painters in New York or wherever they were, mostly New York. And so, there's a little bit of Pollock in these pictures of the black sand, with the sort of shine, the white rocks coming out of it. He at some points went very abstract and was really looking at shape, form, tone, line, all those things we study in art school in a design class. Those things are all apparent and visible in Weston's photographs. Now, he's also meticulously, just obsessive technician, and he shoots with an 8x10 view camera. At this point, they've invented film, so it's no longer glass, and he is just everyone who ever worked with him in any kind of darkroom context just said he was a virtuoso in the darkroom. And he's the one who, when Ansel Adams saw Weston's negatives, Ansel Adams was going to be a piano player as a concert pianist, and instead changed his whole life and his career, because when he saw Weston's, not his prints, by the way, his negatives, he said, "Oh, this is for me." And so, Weston really was the kind of, hero of the group, even though Ansel is the best known of the group, of the F64 group. And so this pepper, is kind of one of the most sought after and collectible photographs ever made. He he started photographing everyday objects, which of course right now seems like a very good idea in the world where we can't go outside and we can't travel. And so, at first it looks like a bell pepper. Yeah, we all know what that is. I'm kind of allergic to them. I can't eat them, whatever. But again, with this kind of idea of abstraction becoming dominant, and you can almost see a human figure, or maybe even two lovers sort of writhing together, for making the animal with two backs, right? And so there is this kind of sensuality to an everyday object, a bell pepper. And it really is a kind of both a literal image of a pepper and an abstract image of a lot of his images, in my opinion, have a kind of figural component to it. They look a little bit like, skin or close-ups of the human body. And so, and they're also abstract while being completely representational, right? 100% it's a photograph of dirt and sand, yes, but it's more than that at the same time. And so that was a phrase that he used to use, actually photograph something not only for what it is, but for what else it is. So, and these kind of, both representational and abstract images are what sort of he was best known for. Now, his children, his son, his grandson have all continued in his vein as photographers, and they're still active, or at least his grandson is still active today, Cole Weston. And so, I mean, they're really beautiful prints in person. They're lovely images. I had an opportunity to buy these when they were just a couple $100. Now they're in the hundred thousands of dollars per print, and I didn't believe it would go up that much. So this is the other one, my favorite one part of it. So, I've been photographing our toilet. That glossy, it's covered for me, so the glossy enameled receptacle of the extraordinary beauty. Here was every sensuous curve of the human figure divine, but minus the imperfections. Never did the Greeks reach a more significant consummation to their culture, and it somehow reminded me, in the glory of its chaste convulsions and its swelling, sweeping forward movement of finely progressing contours of the victory of Samothrace. Now, of course, to us in the 21st century, a toilet is a gross, disgusting thing that we want to touch the least amount we possibly can, right? At the time that he was working, this was a brand new thing. This was a manufactured piece of home, domestic, whatever, that was, it sort of symbolized modernism with a capital M. We're starting to get, standardized pieces of construction materials, which is coming from the Bauhaus, like the 4x8 sheet of plywood, the 2x4 board, the standard shapes of materials that we were building with, and all of a sudden there was this new thing, a toilet. And it's, if you can sort of just try to forget what you do with the toilet and just look at the curves and the lines and the shapes of this particular one, in especially, you can really see how sort of beautiful the forms are, how smooth the surface is, etc. And so, he spent 6 months photographing a toilet. You can also see how, like, his bell peppers and his nudes have similarities, right? That there is the same kind of movement and smoothness and roundness, which were, remember, descriptions of beauty when we talked about that, that they were smooth and light toned and small in scale was another thing. Now, Weston, as I've tried to reiterate, really was and still is to some people the kind of height of straight photography, of modernist photography, of the antithesis of the pictorialist style of photography, which we saw right before this, the soft, fuzzy thing. But instead, Weston and F64, emphasized hard lines and hard focus and contrast and sharpness, and which in their mind, in this group's mind, and I think it makes a lot of sense, really is the sort of thing that photography does best, better than all other sort of creative disciplines. I might have gone overboard with the Westons, so he was also, he didn't actually marry her, but his partner was a woman named Tina Modotti. She's a badass, man. She is really cool. So again, you can see like everyday objects like an onion or, bananas, or I think that's some kind of a squash or gourd or something. Sort of taking them and making them into extraordinary things. So I mentioned his son, this is Brett, and okay, that's his early stuff before he went straight, hard edge, straight edge. Probably his best known nude is this one. It's almost like a line drawing, almost like a charcoal drawing or a graphite drawing, right?
Was that the same effect that like Man Ray would use, like that sunburn thing?
Yeah, it looks like it is, but it's actually not.
Oh, wow.
Just the way he lit it. So it does, but it absolutely looks like solarization, yes. In his case, the nudes were never explicit or never sexualized, but instead, there's actually a couple on the desert after his wife gave birth. They're a little more hard edged, that one. Sort of backed away and you see the whole figure in these. So when his son was born, he of course photographed his son. The series at the bottom there you see, it recurs in the 1980s. Another photographer, or artist I should say, I guess she's a photographer, Sherry Levine, who's sort of notorious for what people call appropriation. Sherry Levine appropriated these pictures of Neil and rephotographed the photographs and then hung them on a wall in a gallery and called them her own. And that's what appropriation, her notorious version of appropriation, really kind of is. She's still around, so I should say what, shouldn't say was. And so, but again, these are beautiful platinum palladium prints of his son Neil that were then rephotographed by a postmodern person, a postmodernist. I have a boy. I think he's beautiful. I didn't make pictures like this of him, but it's also kind of much more of a taboo today than it would have been at during his time. Oh yeah, well that's something else. Okay, so this is no, that's not. That's his wife. We saw her splayed out in the desert. I know a lot of people will agree with some of that. So this is his lover, Tina Modotti. She was also Frida Kahlo's lover and Diego Rivera's lover. They were lovers for considerable, a couple of years together. They worked together in Mexico. Modotti ultimately emigrated to Mexico City and became a communist. As you can see right above her head, that's one of her pictures of the sickle and the hammer, which was a very strong symbol of Soviet communism specifically. And so this was during the Mexican Revolution. She left Weston to do this. So, here's kind of her version of an activist photograph. Of course, part of what was going on in Mexico during the revolution was that the workers were trying to get rights, trying to get unionized, trying to get some sort of safety precautions, all those things that unions do for workers. And of course, as is usual, the government and the businesses didn't want this to happen. So there are lots of violent clashes going on back and forth. And so she's in this picture showing the sort of generic quality of the masses of workers going to their factory jobs at this moment. And so workers' hands, and she really tried to focus on the common man, the everyday, the ideas that were being talked about at the time in socialism and communism. She was trying to show those ideas through her photographs, especially focusing on workers. And so these kinds of things were considered revolutionary. She was actually banned from the United States and not allowed to return because of her involvement with the Mexican Revolution. And again, you can sort of see a classic sort of version of the Mexican communist symbol with the belt, the bullet belt, and the sickle and the guitar. But that's beautiful and also highly symbolic. I'm assuming most of the younger students, people under 30, for example, don't really remember how common this symbol became in the mid 20th century as a kind of symbol of Soviet repression and Soviet style communism. At this point, this was well before any of the sort of negative sides of communism had sort of come to be or come about. This was still a very idealistic time that there would be, and I think there's a lot of echoes of it right now, that, this discrepancy between the incredibly wealthy and the just desperately poor should be addressed in some way. Now, if it's communism or not, this was the goal then. This was like the way they were thinking about the 1% versus the rest of us. I'm showing my own politics here, but it's become very apparent during COVID that the rich are continuing to get much richer, and while the poor and the working class are continuing to get less so. And so the obscenity of the amount of money that the 1%, which was not a phrase they used back then, but we use now, versus the rest of the world, it's really obscene. And so Modati, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, of all variety of other artists were sort of, championing the cause of the work of the everyday person, the rest of us, so to speak. Another sort of odd record is this picture. This is a platinum print again of White Roses that Modati did. Very out of character from all this kind of communist propaganda stuff, which is also beautiful, but it's much more sort of soothing and pleasant. This also in the 1990s was one of the, it was the highest, oh, it's tiny by the way, it's 6 by 8 inches. It went on auction at Christie's and sold for, the first image to sell for more than 7 figures, so more than $1 million. And it was sold to an anonymous buyer that people later traced to being Madonna, apparently, although it's not confirmed, but most people believe Madonna bought it. That's her and Frida. And most of the pictures you've ever seen of Frida Kahlo were taken by Tina Modati. So this one was probably taken by Diego Rivera. She's got a Leica in her hand, by the way, which we'll talk about. So I know a lot of young artists, especially young women, are obsessed with Frida Kahlo's life. It's a really fascinating story, and I understand why. This is her, Diego Rivera, her husband, abusive sometimes, maybe not so, who knows. And so, no. Oh, well, I guess that's it. I'm sorry. Okay, so what time is it? Let's go another 10 minutes and then we'll take our break then. Um, so we were talking about F-64 when I got into to Ed Weston and then Ed Weston's lover, Tina Modotti, which, by the way, if you look at her pictures, are also in the F-64 vein, right? They're sharp, they're contrasty, there's no fuzziness and there's no sentimentality to the pictures. They're conceptually about politics, as opposed to pictorialism, which was like all about beauty and that sort. So using photography as a way to talk about politics and rebellion and other kinds of things. So when F-64 in America, in California specifically, became probably the best known practitioner of F-64 is Ansel Adams. Now, I jokingly say I never want to see another oral presentation about Ansel Adams, and that is true, but it doesn't mean I don't like him, because I do like him, and I think that he was very important to photography and really was one of the most important people to convince the world, and at least this country, that photography can be more than a document or a snapshot, but can be a work of art in itself. And so he's probably best known for the idea of pre-visualization. And what pre-visualization means is that the photographer should become so fluent with their tools and materials, their film, camera, chemistry, darkroom printing, etc., that they can look at a scene and in their mind's eye can see the print before they take the picture. So they pre-visualize the picture in their imagination, and then essentially using all of the craft that they have available to them, exposure, processing of the film, printing in the darkroom, make the picture that they saw in their imagination before they even press the shutter. And so this became the dominant form of photography for at least 50, 60 years in America. And so all of the colleges were beginning to offer photography not as a trade school, but as a sort of option in the art departments. Post World War II, many soldiers were coming back, and they were using the there's a phrase word I can't remember. Basically, if you went to war, you could go to college for free. And so that was one of the promises that the federal government made to young men, primarily men, that if you serve your country, we will pay for your college when you return. And of course, that's a big if you return that they don't mention. But and so colleges began to, universities began to explode. Art departments became part of the higher education system in itself, although we've always had this odd relationship with the rest of the institution, the academy. And this kind of photography became the thing that people taught in art schools. So he wrote a lot of books, but his most important books were The Camera, The Negative, and The Print. And so those were the three parts of his idea of what became known as the zone system. And so the zone system has this kind of idea that there are 10 shades of gray in a picture, and 0 being blackest black, white being, or 10 being paper white, and then sort of 8 shades of gray in between, which is really not accurate, but it works to think that way. And using this process that he teaches you, or the colleges began to teach everyone, you could manipulate the tones in the photograph to your own satisfaction. This is him in Yosemite, probably one of his most famous pictures of Half Dome. is being made here. He'd made a woody station wagon with a platform on top, so he could take his camera out and get a high point of view. And so this is one of the images that is talked about a lot when people talk about Ansel. It's called Moonrise over Hernandez. And using his zone system, he was able to keep the detail in the moon, as well as hold information in this Pueblo town in the dark. So this happened right after the sun set, by the way. That's why the clouds are still kind of glowing from behind. And over the years, he printed this negative in dozens of different ways. It's one of the more sought out images for collectors, at least if he printed it. And then every like 42 years or something, people go back, maybe it's 22 years, people go back and all the conditions are right to make it again. And they all try to sort of crowd up on this one place and try to take the moonrise picture again. But Ansel's pictures were specifically about the ecology, about green, what we now call green issues, or conservation, which is kind of what we called it back then. And so, his pictures, the way that he presented them and published them and exhibited them, were to help people understand the beauty and glory of nature, and to preserve that, and to prevent it being sort of bulldozed and developed into suburban hell. And so his pictures were really kind of glorifying the natural beauty of, in most of his cases, the West Coast, and in particular Yosemite Valley. Although he took pictures in a wide variety of places, those are the ones that most people are aware of. He never made it. Yes.
I assumed, as a fan of his, that these were actually photographs that he knew, as you said, pre-visualized. So he had a good idea of what the time of the day with the lighting, but they were actually manipulated. Like he cut the different parts.
No, okay, not in that way. Not in the way of printing multiple negatives together. They were not manipulated in that way. But what the zone system allows a photographer to do is to manipulate the tones within the picture. So in this case, and for a lot of non-photo people, it seems like, so what? But so here's the zone system in like 3 sentences. In one sense, really. Exposed for the shadows and developed for the highlights. And in 2 more sentences, that means like, make sure you get enough exposure for the dark parts. And so you meter or expose for the shadows. And then in the darkroom, you develop the negative so that the highlights don't wash out. Right? So again, we've got a moon in this case, which would, in most cases, just be solid white. If you've ever tried to take a picture of the moon, you'll find you get just a white dot. And there's some detail in these deep, deep shadows. Even though it's not apparent in the slide, in the real life, you'd see lots of stuff going on here. Now, since the zone system has 10 zones, but our human eye can see like 20 values of gray instead of 10, what the zone system, the manipulation aspect of it is, he could move tones up and down that scale of 10, which is really 8, because black and white are not really in the scale. And so in this particular picture, for example, he most likely overexposed the negative. So whatever his meter said, he gave it more light than he was supposed to, according to the meter. And then in the darkroom, because he was working with sheet film, whatever the development time that the manufacturer said he should use, he would use less than that. So he overexposed and underdeveloped. In other scenes that we might see, he would do the opposite. So on like a hazy gray day, like I'm seeing out my windows right now, what we generally do is we underexpose the negative. We take it less light than the meter suggests we do. And then we overdevelop the film so that we get more contrast in the scene. So basically, the system of manipulation, as I'm calling it, really just allows him to sort of move tones up and down in the scale, and then prevent them from washing out on either side. So in Photoshop, we call that, like when they go off the histogram on either side. And so he sort of developed a system using analog materials to control where the tones would go. Unlike, Annie Brigman, who would like cut pictures up and rephotograph them and do stuff like that. He never did that. He was a straight photographer. But straight is kind of almost an inaccurate term, because he manipulated them through exposure and development to get the pictures he wanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So it's there. I mean, photographers are like mad scientists, it sounds like. You
Yeah,
got to
absolutely.
know all the chemistry and all of the developing process. Wow, it's a lot.
If you glance at those 3 books I mentioned, especially the negative and specifically, there's like dozens and dozens of formulas for making developer that do very specific things to a negative. So there's not just like one kind of developer, which most lay people would probably assume if they even knew there was such a thing as developer. But there, in his case, he would add additives to standard formulas to make more shadow tone, or reduce the percentage of certain elements to make brighter highlights, or those kinds of things.
And now none of that is used with digital photography.
Well, if you know what you're doing, actually, there is some of that, and that's why, the idea of the histogram in digital photography is such an important idea, and it's based on, I mean, theoretically, it's kind of the same thing, right? So if we manipulate the histogram in Photoshop or Lightroom or something, you can stretch out the tones, or you can sort of shrink the tones, or you can move them brighter, or you can move them darker. I mean, these are the kinds of things that he was doing with chemistry and film that we still do in digital imaging applications, like most popularly Photoshop, right? So it is still used. It's just not called the zone system anymore, although there are whole books about digital zone system stuff as well.
Okay, thank you.
But he would also, as you mentioned at the beginning of your statement, he would wait sometimes for days, he said, to get the light right. He would be standing on the top of his station wagon with the camera out and the bulb in his hand, and he would just wait until the weather was right, till the light was right, till the cloud formations were right. And there's a certain drama to this one. I've always loved this one. It's kind of one of my favorites. Another member of the F64 group is Fred Summer. Let's look at him when we get back. So let's take a 15-minute break. So 5 till 1, we'll start again. That's in like 16 minutes. And I'm gonna get some lunch, and I'll see you in 15 minutes, okay? I'm looking through the chat. I love it. Thank you, guys. I can't seem to watch the chat and have the lecture on my full screen, but I really love what you're doing over here, talking to each other about it. Yeah, no question. Mapplethorpe saw Weston's figures. The Salgado has that same kind of mastery of black and white that Ansel has. All right, wonderful. I'm really thrilled with what I just sort of skimmed, but okay, so we're moving on to Summer. And Fred Summer is another one of the members of the F64 group. He's probably the least known of the group, and that's primarily because he didn't make a lot of pictures. Again, he's a kind of consummate craftsperson, very aware of Ansel's idea of the zone system and emphasizing the so-called perfect print. He's got a little bit of more of a surrealist vision than some of the others do. There's a little bit of the grotesque in some of his pictures. So not the kind of grandiose God's clouds thing that we saw with Ansel, right? The light of God coming down onto the valley we see in Ansel, but instead more of a sort of New Mexico landscape, a kind of more of a bleak landscape. These are coyotes that had died for some reason. And it's really pixelated, I'm sorry, but there's a kind of like pattern in this of the saguaro cactuses and the stones kind of alternating between texture and line and texture and line. And they're really sort of contemplative. I think they're much more abstract than we see with other members of the F64 group. These are in a similar way to Weston in that they're sort of perfect negatives, contact printed, not enlarged. Excuse me, I need to clear my throat. Okay.
Professor, there's a student that she was trying to ask you a question, but I guess her mute is not working.
Okay.
So she wants to ask if the artists we are seeing today are ones that we could use for the presentation.
Of course, yes. It's really why I show a wide variety of work so that people have, people have a lot of choices. And I'm trying to expose you to lesser known artists so that we're not doing the same handful of sort of, greatest hits photographers, but people who are, just as good, but kind of more obscure than the big top 10,
Professor, do we have to ask you before for your approval the people we're going to work on, or
it's first
we
come
just
first
do
serve.
it?
So I don't want us to have more than one student doing the same photographer or subject. So this is for the oral presentation specifically. So the sooner you choose, the better, and that person will then be taken, and no one else can do the same person, right?
So I email you. How do I already chosen. I email you or Blackboard?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
@J? Are you choosing @J?
Oh, I choose Adam Fuss. I already interviewed him.
Oh, cool.
I interviewed him twice, and I will do it the oral presentation and a written presentation.
Oh, that's fantastic. Adam Fussy. Yes, I love his work. I'm really a fan. So that's fantastic.
Yes, he accepted an interview, and we Zoomed twice for a few hours, and
Wow.
so I have to transcript it and put it together for oral and written presentation.
And that's wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's a really good idea, especially the photographers who are sort of mid-career, actively working today. They're human beings. They have websites, they have email addresses. They are they're flattered when people say, I love your work. Can you talk to me? Um, some are too busy. A handful of them are overwhelmed with that kind of request and are kind of sick of it and are rude, but all they can do is say no. And so if for your project you choose a living contemporary photographer to sort of research, reach out to them, send them an email. I used to say offer to buy them coffee or sweep the floor, but during COVID that doesn't really work. But be generous and offer them something in return for their time if you do that. So. All right. So we're looking at Fred Summers' work, another member of the F64 group, and frankly my favorite of the group. I sort of love the abstraction and the surrealist aspect of his work. So although F64 continues to be common, dominant in the so-called fine art photography world, other things were going on. And so an important thing, it's not particularly, well, it is actually, but in Germany in the sort of early 20th century, there was a group of artists that came to be known as the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is really an important aspect of modernism. Their architecture, their style of painting, etc., and photography was a very sort of modernist, kind of abstract way of thinking. But the point is that the German school of the Bauhaus died twice, and after the second death, most of the instructors moved from Germany to Chicago, and they founded an art school there, which is now known as the Art Institute of Chicago. But so a lot of the teachers from the Bauhaus came to America, especially during World War II and after. And
that's what Daniel Tegeter went to that school. Okay.
Did, yes. So did my teacher, actually. So one of those people that taught at Art Institute of Chicago is this guy, Harry Callahan. And you can certainly see the influence of the sharp-edged, straight photography kind of approach to things in this image, but he was also manipulating development, etc., in this case to make a very high contrast negative. So the black and white, there's really no gray in between tones. There's no subtlety to it. It's a very sort of like graphic style of an image. Taking recognizable objects, things that are kind of everyday, and also kind of changing them into something that's slightly unrecognizable. And I really don't like this. Got this number here. Okay, chat. That's okay. Yes. Okay. And so Callahan, he taught at the Art Institute of Chicago, and his work, the work that sort of seems relevant to both the landscape and the oncoming of modernism in photography, really, I really kind of like the simplicity of his work, the very subtle beauty of his work. This is, again, as Ansel said, photograph something for not only what it is, but what else it is. If you see the female figure in it, you'll sort of have this aha moment that, just taking a simple twig and making it into something more than that. He also did a lifelong project with his wife. It's one of the sort of greatest photography love stories ever. He and his wife, Eleanor, collaborated on these pictures together. Again, it's had a lot to do with the Gaia mythology that I mentioned earlier, sort of seeing her as mother, as the origins of life of their son and child. And he photographed her in double exposures with the sort of images of the natural environment, double exposed with her sometimes nude, sometimes clothed, sometimes in the water. And so while it's you know, straight photography, because it's not photoshopped, it's double exposed in the camera. I'm going to mute myself for a minute so I can get this. All right, sorry about that. I seem to get this almost every day after lunch. So we're still going here. And another group, another member of that group is Wynn Bullock, who, you know, this particular image is one of my very favorite photographs ever made. And you can certainly see the influence of the sort of straight f/64, everything in sharp focus, foreground to background. There's a kind of mystery to this, an allusion to Japanese scrolls that you might have seen if you go to the Met into the Asian wing. And Bullock, so he's sort of in, I don't know, there's a sense of beauty to his pictures, which are different from the sublime sensibilities of Ansel. Also abstraction. And, okay, so these are just lovely pictures. I've just always thought of them as like gorgeous.
Professor, is that a picture of a cemetery?
I'm sorry?
Is that a cemetery?
This?
Yes.
No, it's a barn. But it does have that sense that of the of the cemetery painting that we saw when we were talking about the sublime, right? It's his wife and his son.
Is this still Wynn Bullock?
It was, yes. All of those
Okay.
were. You can see he sort of has a heavy black hand, like he really likes lots of darkness and lots of dark tones in a lot of his pictures. That kind of darkness, it seems very poetic, but it adds a kind of beauty to it. But it's also kind of, you know, moody, and that's how
It has like, yeah, it has like an uncanny feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They
Can you
look
write the name? I didn't get the name.
Wynn Bullock. They almost look like mythical places you hear about in fantasy stories, like the forest that the villain goes, you know, comes from, or I don't know. I'm reading a lot of that to my son, so. All right. Emmett Gowan. Now, Emmett Gowan is what was a teacher. He also photographed his wife quite a bit in much more realistic way, let me put it. He damn his throat. His probably his most famous student you'll be aware of, even though she denies that she had any formal training in photography, is Sally Mann. And if you know Sally Mann's pictures, and if you look at Emmon Gowan's pictures, and he was her teacher in graduate school, you can see that she really got most of her style, her look, her aesthetic from Emmett. And he also photographed his immediate family as she did. He photographed his wife and his children. And so, you know, there's this kind of Southern Gothic aspect of it, which Sally Mann also has in her work. You know, when I said earlier that he photographs his family, or his wife in particular, in a more sort of realistic style, there's no glamorization, there's no posing, there's, you know, no elegantly curved female form that was a sort of obviously forced pose. Even this look that, you know, when I think of Sally Mann's pictures, you know, I just see this in so many of her images. In this case, he used a lens that was not the right lens for this camera. So the image that was made by the lens wasn't big enough to fill the whole 8x10 sheet of film. And so we get this kind of like a kind of circular image inside a dark field.
Can I have a question, please?
Sure. Yes.
Because you are, I think, in the 60s, and these personal pictures, and it makes me think about Joan Jonas. So how would you put, because Joan Jonas take personal pictures of herself for her video art. So how would you put these pictures into this tradition of the photography you show here? No, it's a question. It's something that occurred to me, that a lot of, since the 60s and 70s, a lot of artists which don't see themselves as photographers, they will take pictures for the works and videos, and Rauschenberg will use it for his collages. So how will it enter into this frame of photography, history of photography?
You know, the 60s and 70s in photography and in related media has a kind of, I mean, photography in one sense, it's something I'm going to talk about in another lecture, but snuck into the high art world through performance, through happenings, through earth art, right? At the time of that I've been speaking of, prior to the 70s, photography really as a creative discipline, as a creative medium, had this kind of ghettoized status, right? There was the photography galleries, and then there were the art galleries. And even though we tried to legitimize the medium through pictorialism, through straight F-64 style photography, it was still delegated to the second-rate status. And the high arts like painting and sculpture, the beaux-arts, right? They were the collectible. They were the people who were talked about as far as cultural innovators. And photography had this kind of bastardized status. And so there came along a whole generation, we still see them, of people that call themselves, I'm an artist that uses photography, and I'm not a photographer, right? And so this has become this kind of secondary way. Now, frankly, to me, it means they didn't take the time to learn the craft, right? That's the only difference between photographers as artists and artists that use photography in their work. And so I strongly believe in craft. I know that conceptualism and modernism and a lot of other postmodernism and even, you know, whatever we're in right now often disregards craft as something that's just like, it's petty and not important, and some of the ideas that are important. And, but I think, I mean, the question you asked is much more rich and much more full than the answer that I just gave. But really what happened in the 70s was photography became a way to document an installation, a performance, as I said, an earth art piece, whatever. And so, you know, in the 70s in particular, someone would come in and do a conceptual performance and leave the gallery, and it would be either empty or there'd be a pile of tires and some trash in the corner, right? Like there was nothing to see after the performance itself ended. So what happened then was galleries needed to pay the rent. They needed to, you know, pay the power bill. They needed to pay the staff so they could eat and, you know, get a roof around their, over their head. And so they began to put photographs of the performance, of the, you know, the artwork is somewhere in a, you know, a lake in a place in the, like in a flyover state nobody ever goes to, but it can only be sold in New York City. So we start to see pictures of Spiral Jetty show up in galleries for sale. And you can't buy Spiral Jetty, right? But you can buy a photograph of Spiral Jetty, and that way photography entered into the high art gallery scene rather than the bastardized photography gallery scene. And so performance in particular, I think that in the 70s, 60s and 70s especially, you know, the idea of much more informal work that's focused more and more on navel gazing, right, on the self rather than the world outside of them, became much more commonplace. And it's not a full answer to your question, I know, and it's a lot of my own personal opinion thrown in there, but that's kind of how I could briefly answer your question, which is a great question. No, it's a really interesting idea. So, does that make sense?
A lot of sense. Just one mention, because there is a difference between documenting and registrating a process from the outside, as you about the performance, and it's different when the photography is an inherent part of the performance, like Bruce Nauman when he registered his studio for many hours, or Joanne Jonas when she uses it actively as inherent part of her work. So then it becomes like more complicated because of the way photography can be like very active part in this mixture of things, no?
No question. And when we get to the 70s and we get to conceptual art and sort of, you know, the beginning of postmodernism, which is kind of what you're referencing really, then we'll have other discussions about that. But yes, but it also does go back to that, the comment I made earlier about the conversation between photography and in that case painting, but now photography and conceptualism. You know, there's a lot to be said. This is Gowan's wife peeing. So there's a kind of like, you know, really personal thing, like the afternoon after Christmas when the living room is full of trash, right? For those of you who celebrate Christmas. And so it's not like perfectly neatly, you know, styled, and there's like the act of such a personal thing being something worthy of photographing, and not only photographing, but then, you know, exhibiting and showing in a book. We went from these kind of highly idealized, you know, views of, you know, the landscape to much more intimate and personal kind of things. So that's him and his wife when they were younger. But I mainly show him because of his relationship with Sally Mann. And I have some real issues with Sally Mann. And one of them is that she never acknowledged Emmett Gowan's influencing. And if you do know her, or like her first couple of books, especially, and you look at this picture, you're like, how can you not see Emmett Gowan's influence onto her book Immediate Family or something? So
Maybe she had an affair with him and was a little bitter.
It was very common in art schools at the time. I tell you, my professor married 2 of his graduate students. So, and that could be from immediate family, it seems to me. So, so somebody else who taught at the Bauhaus, at the American Bauhaus, meaning the what's now the Art Institute of Chicago, is this guy, Aaron Siskin. And I think he's the perfect illustration of how photography can be simultaneously representational and abstract. When I took my first design class in art school, we were talking about negative space, and the teacher at the time like showed Siskin, this series of Siskins, because we're not supposed to look at the rocks, we look at the space between the rocks. And that's how you begin to understand the negative space in any kind of an artwork. It's not, it's the shapes that the non-rocks make. And so, while obviously it's just rocks, there is a kind of formalism, a kind of like abstraction to this stuff that sort of puts it in both worlds of the kind of contemporary theory of the time of abstraction and the photographic aspects of F64 and straight photography and the perfect negative and a great print and a lovely, beautiful object that is the photographic print. In the 70s, things changed in a lot of ways. In photography, there was a show up in Rochester at the Eastman House called the New Topographics. It's 1977. 1977 is the year that punk sort of arrived. Angry young men screaming into microphones about not having jobs and not having a future. And, the Reagan era was about to become a part of America. There was a lot of social upheaval. The 60s and 70s had sort of, had a lot of influence on how people were being raised and treated. There was still, I think similar today, a very strong right-wing group of people who, they were criminalizing heroin because it would keep the African-American population down. They're criminalizing marijuana because that would keep those damn college hippies down. And so, there was a way that the dominant culture of the time, the kind of Nixon, Reagan era of politics was really something that was changing. And I see it. Okay. All right. Yeah. This show, it was really, like, honestly, a kind of a small show. It's gotten so much attention since it happened, but it was at it was at Eastman House. Nobody goes to fucking Rochester, right? I mean, it's cold. It's not pleasant. There's not much to do there, except the Eastman House. The Kodak is gone. So it was still there in the 70s, so I shouldn't say it was gone then. But this group of photographers, instead of turning their camera lenses onto the grandeur and the beauty of the natural environment, and like Ansel trying to save the, save the environment from developers and sort of show the world how, but that's not how people live. Most people at this time and still today live in a city or they live in a suburb. Most people in the 70s did. Very few people were still sort of like living in this idealistic farmer, peasant lifestyle where you raise your own food and sleep with your cattle. No, people were like, in houses, in subdivisions. And so even the idea of the subdivision sort of came along in the late 70s and late 60s, early 70s. And so instead of photographing, Yosemite Valley, these photographers looked at the landscape around us, which was, industrial complexes. It was the developments of tract homes in the suburbs around small, middle, and large cities. In this series of pictures, he photographed the construction of a subdivision. And the idea of tract homes, I mean, my parents, I lived in one when I was very young, and you basically got a catalog. There were 5 kinds of houses. You could pick one of those 5, and there were 5 colors you could pick from. So there's really 25 variations. And you got a quarter of an acre of a lot. You got one of the 5 houses and one of the 5 colors. And there were hundreds of them around you, exactly the same. And so I'd go over to my friend's house from like middle school, and it felt like I was in my house because it's the same internal design as the house that we lived in. They just had chosen a different color on the outside of it. And so the new topographics, to get back to them specifically, sort of saw this as a more appropriate representation of the landscape than these kind of abstracted ideas of beauty and the sublime and nature with a capital N sort of thing. And so, a lot of people criticize this, like, why do I want to see pictures of parking lots? That's just stupid. But ultimately, the conceptual basis behind the work became really important. That photography, and landscape photography specifically in this case, was about the built environment rather than the natural environment. There was a husband and wife team that taught in Germany at a very specific school, and they were the educators or the teachers of a lot of the 21st century's sort of biggest names. But their work was always sort of similar way. They would photograph these man-made objects. Post-industrial objects is one way to describe them. Things that during the Industrial Revolution were, amazingly important, but had probably sat for 20 or 30 years unused since then. And so they would sort of photograph these abandoned industrial places and then turn them into grids. So they'd sort of collect things, until they got enough, collect weird spherical, like probably chemical tank things. In this case, until they got 9 of them and put them into a grid. And another thing that was big in the 70s, by the way, was the grid. So this idea of the grid was, being as a kind of abstraction popularized in a variety of different ways. And they'd sort of exhibit these, notice there's no people, right? There are no, like very rarely do you see a car or any representation of humanity in these images, except that the objects themselves are 100% man-made, right? And so they were in the show. God, what was his name? Louis Baltz was in the show. And there's 7 photographers, or 7, there are a couple, by the way, in that case. And so, but it's, I mean, literally, like they're taking pictures of parking lots. And to the kind of older, traditional F-64 straight landscape photographers, this was blasphemy. This was a horrific idea. But it really is, focusing more on the man-made environment that we live in than the, I shouldn't have kept these in, than the natural environment, which was created. So they were straight photographers as well, just in the vein of F-64, right? Robert Adams is perhaps the most well-known of the group. He wrote a couple of books. He's had a lot of attention paid to him for some of his other work outside of this, but again, photographing, in this case, mobile home, not subdivisions, but Dusseldorf School. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you. And so, one second, I need to open the door. So, you know, the important thing is that this was kind of a huge shift in the way that people approached landscape photography. We began to include evidence of what my favorite phrase is, the hand of man, right? And the hand of man becoming even ultimately the subject of the photographs and not the background. So, you know, Joe Deal was another one, and sort of, you know, really emphasizing the kind of built environment rather than the natural environment, as I said. Stephen Shore was one of these. Now, again, or something I haven't mentioned really is that you may have noticed that I've primarily been showing black and white photography up until now. And so Stephen Shore was one of the very first serious art photographers to adopt color. Color, you know, black and white was the medium of a serious photographer. Color was for snapshots and for you know, amateurs to use. And so by his introduction of 8x10 color, by the way, it's not 35mm Kodachrome slides, it's a large format, slow to use camera similar to the ones they used with wet collodion, you know, back in the day, but it's still loaded with color film rather than black and white film. And at first, again, this was not taken very seriously because most serious photographers worked in black and white. His pictures were also banal. And a lot of the new topographic photographers were taking pictures of nothing, right? People would sort of look at what's the subject of this picture? What, you know, to us in the, you know, 2020s, they're awesome cars and like an amazing, you know, design for this movie theater. But at the time, this was just a street scene with no real, like, particular interest in it. I mean, the Poseidon Adventure movie is kind of an interesting moment, but it wouldn't have been to the people during the time that this picture was made. And so when we look at literally pictures of parking lots, over time, they have this extra sort of level of nostalgia for the design of the clothes or the cars in this case, you know, but that wasn't the case when they were being made. These were really just sort of everyday moments in the life of an average American, middle American at the time. Gelke is another one of this group. Again, sort of focusing on industrial things, primarily from the sort of agricultural world of things. Wessel photographing sort of small summer houses in California. And then again, making grids in the way we saw the Beckers doing with these. But in color, you'll notice they're not black and white, but they're in color. And I'm not so interested in you knowing all the names of all of the 7 of the people who were in the new topographics exhibit at Eastman House in 1977, but more of the idea that really the approach to making pictures about the landscape changed from this idea of looking at beauty and sublime and grandeur and awe of nature, and was turned more to the everyday object. Now, as I mentioned, Robert Adams is probably the best known of the group. And it's, you know, primarily because he wrote a couple of books about beauty and photography. But his pictures are really interesting in retrospect. At the time, I have to admit, I didn't see the interest. Why? So the mom went to the grocery store with the daughter and they got some dog food or whatever. I just like, who gives a shit, really? And so, you know, an old lady walking through a gas station. This was the kind of thing that we saw all the time. Now this one I think has a little different, and it's probably the most reproduced of his pictures because of that silhouette of what sort of has become an icon of the kind of lonely housewife left alone in this supposed utopian futuristic world of the suburban tract home. And yet it's just a kind of 2-dimensional flat lifestyle and existence that ultimately we'll see in another photographer's work, you know, much more contemporary photographer, how that kind of suburban idea, like utopian ideal becomes actually a kind of isolating nightmare of loneliness and of just desperation, really. You know, again, Adams, Robert, not Ansel, but Robert Adams is being, you know, a fantastic technician. And although these JPEGs don't do it justice, he also adopted the kind of technical prowess that was typical of a classically trained photographer versus, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, an artist that uses photography. So, you know, you could see pictures like this actually in, oh, I can't forget his name. All the buildings on the Sunset Strip, somebody help me. Ed Ruscha. So Ed Ruscha's photographs of all the buildings on the Sunset Strip became that book. And you know, he's a person who, as was alluded to earlier, who calls himself an artist that uses photography rather than a photographer. We're seeing similar images by Robert Adams of a kind of banal street in a middle American town, but approached with a different kind of sort of attitude, maybe, idea. Ruscha did a series of 16 gas stations, color snapshots rather than like high art black and white photographs. So, you know, these two worlds are beginning to overlap. We're starting to see sort of similarities between the New York City, at that time, Soho gallery world and the ghettoized photography exhibition spaces, as I mentioned. So there's been a couple of real resurgence of interest in that new topographics group. A couple of years ago, the Met recreated the whole show with all the same exact images from the original exhibition. Over time, it became much more influential than it was immediately after it was exhibited. Alex Soth is one of photographers who's represented by Magnum. And Magnum is a photo agency we're going to talk about in another context, in another module of the class. But he's kind of one of the most popular young Magnum photographers who's emerging today. He did this whole series of something by the Mississippi River. And so in this project, though, he went to Niagara Falls. Now, we talked about Niagara Falls in the context of the sublime power of the water flowing over, you know, it's like this kind of 19th century, early 20th century ideal of the power of nature versus the puny human. Instead, Soth focused his lens, made photographs about, you know, in the mid 50s through the 60s and 70s, that was a destination for you know, young, recently married couples from all over America, but particularly the Northeast, would go to Niagara Falls for their honeymoons. And they had these specialty hotels that were, you know, kind of fancy for a middle-class person who's just married with not much money and, you know, not able to afford to go to Paris for their you know, their honeymoon. So, but what happened over time is since the 70s, really, that area in the Northeast up there has just kind of stopped, and it hasn't changed, especially the Niagara Falls, the city right next to it. Like all those hotels are kind of still there, but now they're like run down and they're kind of grubby, but they still have this kind of 70s cool, like mid-century modernism look to them, but the concrete is cracking and the like chairs are fading and all these other things. And so instead of photographing the grandeur of the falls the way a sort of like, you know, traditional landscape photographer would focus on, he instead focused on the kind of banality of that reality. And so I mentioned the Beschers and the Beckers earlier as part of that group of the photographers that exhibited in the the New Topographics exhibition up in Rochester. They were obviously very important photographers in and of themselves, but they're equally, if not more so, important educators. And as was pointed out in the chat, they taught at the Dusseldorf Academy in Germany. And most of so if you went to an art museum between like 1995 and 2015, you would likely encounter a very large color photograph, perhaps of an industrial space, perhaps of a vast group of workers assembling something in China, maybe a whole parking lot full of recently manufactured automobiles. And these photographs were on selling at auction and in the art market in galleries for hundreds of thousands to literally millions of dollars. And so this kind of photography, most of those photographers that I'm sort of describing there in a generic way studied at the Dusseldorf Academy with the Beschers or the Beckers. It depends, I hear it different ways. And so there they are in their old cuteness. And so, you know, their influence, not only of their photographs, but of their teaching on that generation of young photographers was crucial. Now, their influence was a German sort of school of art, and it was part related to the Bauhaus Academy that I mentioned, was an idea called the new objectivity, a kind of straight view of things, of the world. And so, you know, this photographer in particular, Alexander Rodchenko, you know, really turned his camera onto very kind of straight, formally designed structural images. And many of the Bauhaus school photographers had this kind of rigorous, straight design kind of approach to their photography. And we can see that how that evolved into the Beschers' work, right? Those post-industrial structures that they would photograph and turn into a grid. So another one of that group with the new objectivity is Alexander Rangel-Pach, finding in nature, in this book in particular, these kind of elements of design and abstraction, and sort of making pictures of that kind of thing, not from the industrial world as much as from the natural world. And so these photographers from the 30s, 40s, and 50s really were a group that really influenced the Beschers and the Dusseldorf Academy students of the 21st century, right? So there's a lot of these, and I'm going to go kind of quickly through them, but it is this idea of design in the sense that the Bauhaus Academy kind of was focusing on the beauty of the man-made object, right? Sort of glorifying industrialization, glorifying design, and in some ways, like this one, abstraction of everyday objects. And so, you know, this idea of the new objectivity sort of, while things were happening over in America that we've been talking about with F-64 and pictorialism and all that shit, but here in Europe, particularly in Germany, other things were continuing and evolving that really had a lot to do, especially with the school of the Bauhaus. Now, as I said, Bauhaus ended up in Chicago, which is why the Chicago skyline looks the way it does, by the way. But I'm going to skim through these because I'm running out of time and I want to get through them quickly. But I think you can see this sort of straight kind of photography, but really with an emphasis on abstraction and form and design, either from the natural world or from the man-made world. Okay, I'm going to skip all of this because I put way too many in. Some days I get obsessed and I just add a lot. So probably the best known student of the Beschers of that Dusseldorf Academy is this guy, Andreas Gursky. Gursky has, you know, set auction prices as the highest photographs ever sold at auction numerous times now. There was a period of time in the 80s, I mean, in the 90s and early aughts, where every museum in the world worth their salt had to have a good representative image of that school. And most of them wanted a Gursky, right? And so there was actually a not enough Andreas Gursky photographs going around. And at one point, one of his pictures went for, outrageous numbers of millions of dollars. And people still sort of, I'll show the picture and it's, you're gonna go, what the fuck, when you see it. But he also photographed like massive things, like this candy store has such a great picture of just color and plastic crap and junk food. And, it's like the perfect metaphor for American consumption. Like this is modern consumption. This is one of his earlier pictures. He also did a whole project about workers as well, focusing on massive manufacturing plants, particularly in Asia and China, especially, getting access to these places that build, I think this is baskets in Mexico in this case. And so, technically amazing pictures that are, as you can see by the scale of this installation view, twice the size of the person standing in front of it. So trying to compete with painting in scale, really through the 80s and the postmodern era of painting, paintings got to be the size of billboards. They were vast and huge. And so photography looked like a wall label next to, one of the sort of 80s style painters. And so photography had to scale up to compete with those pictures in a museum situation. And these are all brand new manufactured cars. And another member of that group is, I can't see her name. Candida Hoffer, that's right. And so, there was, I think, 2 or 3 women involved, but she's kind of the best known of those, of that group, best known woman of the group. She photographs these kind of places of spectacle, right? In this case, an opera theater. She gets access to the back, the insides of beautiful libraries or archives of, musical instruments or whatever it may be. So looking at, this sort of places where important things, cultural things or political things happen. And that's the New York Public Library. That's a private library, the Brooklyn Museum. And oftentimes there's performative works here, there's musical concerts here in that space. Alex Hoot is another of the group. There's his view camera, 8x10 camera. He's probably the lesser known of the group as far as I think. Thomas Roof doing these almost like, kind of like driver's license ID photos with like no expression on the sitters' faces, a blank, dull, like emptiness. And again, these are, enlarged, extremely large and hung quite high on the wall. So the viewer has to kind of look up at this kind of installation. The project that he did for the Metropolitan Museum was installed in the grand entrance there. And there was some video projections on the walls that were, 30 by 50 feet in size. So I'm gonna jump ahead. No, I don't have time. All right, so I'm not gonna be able to get really through it all. Now I just want to give a mention. I need to stop in about 4 minutes, but I'm going to give a little bit of a warning because there's pornography coming your way. And I just want you to be aware of that. So one of Ruff's projects was he was downloading low quality JPEG porn pictures and then enlarging them to gigantic scale. So there were just big blobs of flesh, kind of pixels of flesh. So that's kind of one of his more recent projects. Thomas Struth is somebody who photographs in museums, again, places where culture is stored, where culture is kind of communicated to its audiences. And he did this project as well in downtown Lower Manhattan in the 80s, where he went there on Sunday mornings, and basically Wall Street and that financial district, FIDI, is kind of abandoned on Sunday mornings. And so you got these kind of empty Manhattan landscape views, cityscape views. But this is what he's really known for. And what's interesting to me is actually all of these people in the picture, while you might just think they're like common visitors to the museum looking at the artworks in I think this is it's in Italy somewhere, I've been there. And but they're actually actors. All of these people he's hired and he's posed and he's styled, and he's sort of like given them directions on how to sort of look at the work. But so he makes a lot of work that sort of, and oftentimes these people in the pictures, by the way, they work for the museum in the back. They're like the painting restorers, or the people who are the art movers, or the people who like, I don't know, design exhibitions for the museum, and you never see them up front. So he uses the staff from the back and puts them in the front of the pictures. All right, so I'm going to finish up now because I'm out of time. But this was another project that he did there's a garden in the middle of Berlin that he did this project in. So it's a kind of play on what we've been talking about, where this is actually entirely man-made, right? It's got the hand of man all over it, so to speak, but it's actually looks like it's nature, but it's fake nature, like Central Park is fake nature, right? So there's this kind of meta play on the natural landscape replaced by the man-made landscape, then replaced again by the man-made natural landscape. And of course, most viewers look at these and go, pretty pictures of plants, right? So, all right, I'm gonna stop there. Have a good week, everyone. I hope you do well, and I'll see you.
Professor, we wanted to
I have a
ask.
quick question.
One at a
Oh, I'm
time.
sorry. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
As far as where we are, I guess at the end of this class, what is I guess a good takeaway, or what would
What's
be a
gonna be on
good
the
culminating point? Huh? What was that?
What's going to be on the test? What you're asking?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, because it's a whole lot of information that's, I guess, being given. So I just wanted to know, maybe if not some of the dates and important, I guess, things, like what should we be focusing on?
Let me just say that every date that is important, I've told you that's important, right? And other than that, I'm not worried about dates. I mean, hopefully you can tell the difference between a 19th century photograph and a 21st century photograph, but I'm not so worried about exact dates. I'm not even always so worried about exact names of the artists. I'm much more, the point of the class is the concepts, how we went from pictorialism to F64. What's that? How did that happen, right? Why did it go from soft, fuzzy, painterly pictures to sharp, everything in focus pictures? That's the lesson I'm trying to tell. Now, I know all of you have this question about what's going to be on the test and how it's going to be. I will absolutely give a review the week before, and I will re-emphasize the things that I think you need to remember. And I will, and yes, so try to relax about that.
Okay.
Yes, Lena, Central Park is entirely man-made. Was there another question? But
And what is due next week? Like,
there's nothing on the syllabus that's due next week. You should have read that 3-part article in the Times. I didn't put new readings in because that's so long.
thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you all.
Thanks
Bye,
for everything.
Professor. Have a good one.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.